Good afternoon and good morning. I'm Natalie Huber. I am the PBS Chief Engineer in the Office of Architecture and Engineering. So thanks everybody for joining today. Just wanted to do a brief introduction for the core building standards. So I think most of you are somewhat familiar with this document, which was rolled out about 2 months ago. And this is the replacement document for the P100, which was rescinded after the significant amount of executive orders came out in January. We here at the PBS headquarters started making updates to the 2024 P100 that was currently in effect. And as we were going through it with the various P100 steering committee members and technical committee chairs, it was really becoming quite a cumbersome process to cut down the P100 to the requirements that we were looking to go to with our requirements for projects, and that we were trying to get down to following building codes as our minimum performance standards, and then any legislative and executive requirements on top of that. So we found it a bit more streamlined of an approach to transition to the core building standards and create that document from scratch, since it was going to be so different from what the P100 was. So that's kind of where we wound up with the core building standards, which we're going to go over today. There is also an FAQ document for frequently asked questions that is available for GSA personnel, that's available on Insight, that answers a lot of the questions that we've already received about the core building standards. And today I want to give a huge thank you to the folks that have helped to put this together, the core building standards themselves, as well as today's presentation, the members of the technical committees for our requirements documents here at PBS. So thanks to everyone. We also have joining us today our chief architect, Chuck Hardy, and Chuck is going to start us off with some words as well. So Chuck, and I'll turn it over to you.
So I just wanted to open up a little bit with the mindset around this is meant to, as Natalie noted, comply with all our executive orders and mandates that are coming our way. That's why the P100 was taken down. CBS stood up. The CBS all come from the P100, so by default, you all should be meeting all the core standards already. So don't need to have people validate that or worry about that if they're not if they complied with P100.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. All right, appreciate your time. We're going to turn it over to Lance Davis.
All right. Hello there, everyone. I am Lance Davis, architect out of our central office, and have been involved with putting together the CBS and the questions and the training here today. The format for today is we've got a lot of speakers and a lot of different sections. We're trying to hit all of them so where that you have a clear picture of what's going on. We're probably going to spend, looking at the time now, about 4 minutes per section. And we're going to take a question or two after each section and then try to get to the rest of the questions at the end of the session, at the end of the training here today. So please use the Q&A function. Do not raise your hand. Do not come off mute. Put it into the Q&A. We'll get to them best that way and keep moving forward. So next, Ben. All right, and again, we're going to start off with our general section, general information. You've heard this several times, the core building standards replaces P100, and it applies to projects that projects that have reached 50% construction as of January 21st can continue using the P100 that was in their contract. For any other projects that are less than 50% construction that were either in design or in construction at that point, have a couple options of how they're going to work through this process. And so all projects need to start off by going to their A&Es and identifying any non-required scope. The AEs can then look to prepare a list of those proposed changes and then look at doing a life cycle cost assessment of those changes. They also should be thinking about, as they're doing this, looking at whatever those potential changes are or the potential savings, and whether or not the cost of them to evaluate is going to be a wash or is actually going to provide the government with the cost savings. We don't need to be spending AE time to be looking at things that aren't going to save us any money at all. So let's focus on the big items that are actually going to save some money. And those are the things we really need to be looking at. Projects that are in design, the contracting officers need to evaluate their solicitations and make a determination as to what those proposed changes are, and that can come out of the solicitations. And then if need be, they can suspend the work to make these evaluations happen. So they may need to pause the design work as it's ongoing, so that the government can do a review and figure out what those next steps are. For construction projects, they need to really engage with the stakeholders, the project managers, the Office of Project Delivery, Office of Architecture and Engineering, to figure out what really can be looked at and thought about that can be taken out of that project potentially as a cost savings. And then working with their contracting officers on those impacts to the contract and the cost savings that could be realized. And then there is that option, or there is that ability that as we're looking at it, anything that provides a significant adverse financial, life safety, security, or critical operations can look at getting an exemption. So it may already be, partially constructed or, framed out or whatever. And so it may not make sense to pull that out of the project at that point in time. So next, Ben. So here are a couple sort of key elements that are really important to sort of understand. GSA is unable to waive federal legal requirements. So if it's in law, we cannot waive it. Those projects have to do it. They have to figure out how to incorporate it. They already should have been, because it was already required more than likely in P100 in the first place. But any projects going forward, these are unwaiverable requirements now. We are using as our baseline the CBS, the Core Building Standards, requires the use of most of the I codes, not all of them. So in the CBS, as we're calling it, just because it's shorter, and we love our acronyms, there is a list of the I codes that are used, and so you can take a look at that and see which ones apply to your project. The authority having jurisdiction is the chief architect, so that's Chuck, or designees. So in some cases, fire protection or vertical transportation, some of those aspects, a designee may be determined for a particular area of the country, or out of central office, that can review and provide the authority having jurisdiction. Code interpretation decisions will need to come from the authority having jurisdiction. Updated CBS, we are planning to update the submittal matrix. This was a very popular tool for the P100. It very clearly denoted what our design teams had to submit to prove that they were complying with P100. So we are going to update that and refresh it for the CBS, and we're hoping to get that finished up here shortly and get it in the review process and get it out here very soon to everyone, so that y'all can start using it on your projects and your design teams have a clear understanding of what their submittals are going to be. For IIJA and IRA projects, there are supplemental requirements. And so if you're working on one of those, hopefully you're aware of what those additional requirements are, and what you need to be doing for those particular types of projects. Local and state codes should be considered, but are not required except for impacts to off-site terrain and infrastructure. And so here's a general list. So basically, if we're connecting up to city services like water, gas, electrical power, communications, those sort of things, we need to match and marry with those connections and those materials and depths and various construction means and methods type of thing. So we need to make sure that all of that is working with what is available locally. Fire protection is another great one, understanding what the local fire protection people require, especially things like vehicle access. What do they have available that they could actually help take care if there is an event in a federal building? So understanding those sort of things and working with them to make sure we have a clear understanding. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Walter to talk about energy and other aspects.
Take a break for questions.
Check.
I'm going to pause here just a second for questions. Lance?
Okay. And let's see, what do we have?
I can kind of integrate that question into my piece. Maybe
Okay.
I'll just go ahead and get started.
Yep, sounds
Okay.
Great, thanks for that overview, Lance. So my name is Walter Tersch from the Center for Engineering, and I'm just going to start with what's out and then talk about what's in terms of energy efficiency. The biggest change that's out with the core building standards is electric vehicle service equipment, or EVSE, or charging stations. No longer required, and that work is generally being canceled in accordance with new executive orders and PBS orders. We're no longer requiring leader sites certification. We're no longer requiring the guiding principles for sustainable federal buildings. I will talk about how we can ensure compliance with the legal requirements that are on the books. But in terms of, Bob Swigart's request for examples of things that are allowed that might realize cost savings, here's a half dozen major ones, including designing the building to be net zero ready, electrify all electric systems for HVAC. In some cases, the upfront costs of a heat pump system may be higher than the methane natural gas system. So fossil fuel equipment is back on the table. Same thing, although GSA never had a mandate to install renewables, you don't need to do any kind of renewables that go beyond what's necessary to meet the core building standards. But it is okay if there is documentation that such equipment is life cycle cost effective. In terms of what is in energy-wise, LEED certification is still allowed where the tenant requests it and they fund it with an RWA to cover any kind of design or documentation work that goes beyond what's otherwise required by law or core standards. In other words, their time and money needed specifically to achieve certification from LEED or Green Globes or sites for that matter. Similarly, we leave the control up to our architects and engineers on how they need to qualify a building as applying sustainable design principles. In many cases, saying how they meet the guiding principles is the most efficient way, but we are not mandating that. There's some flexibility there, and they can talk to me for guidance on how to qualify that. That applies only to new construction and major modernizations. Last but certainly not least on this slide is really the biggest one, and the one that really provides the most of a driver for energy efficient design in our buildings, which can often save money, of course, as you know. And that is that the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 has a legal requirement that's been on the books for over 17 years to reduce fossil fuel usage from on-site combustion by 80 to 90%. 80% for fiscal 20 through 24 design starts, and 90% for fiscal 2025 through 2029 design starts. So in effect, although we're no longer requiring electrification, it's going to be very hard to meet that legal requirement while still using substantial quantities of fossil fuels for on-site combustion. Next, please. Here's a little bit more information on that last point. To be clear, we're not prohibiting fossil fuel using equipment anymore, but there are limits that are in these ESA Section 433 provisions referenced here and linked from the core standards, along with the frequently asked questions that Chuck released last week that do provide guidance to your designers on how they can comply with those legal mandates. Similarly, ASHRAE 90.1 version 2019 for the Code of Federal Regulations remains required for new construction and RNA projects. Great question one. And we are not requiring sites certification. Brandon Hart's sitting next to me. We'll talk a little bit more about sites in just a minute, but that is not a requirement from GSA at this time. So basically, any energy efficient life cycle, any energy efficient technology that's life cycle cost effective can and should be considered. As long as it's Buy American compliant and other laws, consider everything. Just really the guiding principle, no pun intended, for our project teams now is documenting that things are life cycle cost effective if they touch energy, or they're cost neutral if they are just material related. Next slide. Material wise, we no longer require environmental products declarations for concrete and asphalt. That was only in P100. So our projects that are not using IRA money do not need to use low carbon materials. Similarly, the construction and demolition of C&D waste diversion mandate existed only from executive orders. So that's gone. We no longer have the standards for interior finishes. We no longer require whole building life cycle assessments. However, low carbon materials for construction and modernization are allowed where the contractor voluntarily chooses to use them, and we're doing so as cost neutral, cost the same or less as a conventional material, same kind of concrete, steel, and asphalt, etc. For projects that are using IRA money, there are IRA specific requirements that still apply. We're working with EPA and GSA leadership to streamline those, and more information will be coming, but that's a whole separate topic. Waste diversion is up to the project team. In some cases, it can avoid costs that we'd otherwise have to pay to throw materials in landfill. So scrap can still make sense, and it's up to the project team. We're just not mandating it. Next slide. Just a little bit more information about what is in terms of materials, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act does have some information there about trying to choose materials composed of recovered materials. So although we're not saying, you have to have low carbon, recovered materials like concrete that contains fly ash or slag is something that remains a priority through law. Similar with bio-based products. So we do have some general mandates in there, and there are links to the language that's required here in the CDS. And Nick Lucas, Natalie, has asked about a code document containing clauses and attachments. I think Anthony Huskisson is talking about something like that. Anthony's not here today, but
No, yeah, if there's any questions we can't address right now, we'll get back to everybody.
yeah, we're going to document that question. Thank you, Nick. And Brian, we see your question about courthouse security desk. We have a section coming up about specialized spaces, so we'll talk more about courts design standards, etc. So with that, I will pass it for now and keep looking at the questions. We are going to actually come back, by the way, to the question about EVs. I'm going to let the electrical experts talk a little bit more about that when we come to that. But here to talk about community planning is Karen B. Hansfield. We go way back.
Way back. Only been a few decades. Hi, I'm Karen Hansfield from the Center for Community Planning and Design. The community planning portion is not going to change dramatically, mostly because our directives are primarily based in statute. They're going to fall into three different buckets, which will probably be familiar to P100 users in the past. Compliance with local codes, and so that's community planning context, zoning and land use, economic development, urban design, relevant urban history, and those submissions are going to be in the form of narratives or graphics. Consultation with local officials. This will involve the community stakeholder analysis, which is usually started at least by the project teams, but the design teams should also contribute and be familiar and submit those along with their materials. And then public use of federal buildings. And so that's two components. One would be internal spaces that may be used for public use, and then also public access to and from the site. So what pathways look like, what connections to local infrastructure like transit, and also access to neighborhood amenities look like. Again, those submissions are going to be narrative and graphical in form. Things that are out for community planning and design are the prescriptive and performance-based requirements. Previously, there were references to LEED and pursuit of particular LEED points to comply with some of these community planning pieces, and those are no longer going to be relevant or required. Again, if you're pursuing LEED certification, nothing prevents you from pursuing this. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brandon Hartz, for landscaping.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Brandon Hartz. I'm a senior landscape architect in the Center for Community Planning and Design with Karen. And I'll be here to talk to you about the second half of section 2, which is on landscape. So the CBS represents a major shift in how we do work. And that's really felt quite significantly in the landscape section because, quite frankly, we don't have a lot of laws and statutes which deal specifically with landscape architecture. So what we do have, well, I'll be really clear about what's in and I'll be really clear what's out. But what you'll notice is that a lot of what was in P100 really was agency driven. And so we have a lot that's actually out. So what's in, I want to be clear, the federal stormwater law, ESA section 438 is still in the standards. You may have remembered looking into chapter 2 of P100 to find that before. It's actually not in section 2 of the CBS. We've moved it to section 8. So if you're wondering where that's cited, it's just moved to a different section. I did want to make a quick point about the GSA memo, which came out in 2019, which gave guidance to project teams about how to incorporate ESA section 438 into their project workflow. There was specific language in that memo that referenced renovations of existing rooftops and how that would trigger disturbance area as well as mitigation factors. Well, that went above and beyond the law. That was a GSA enhancement to the ESA law. So existing roofs are being renovated no longer count toward your ESA area. I want to quickly touch on some environmental permitting, the Clean Water Act, as well as the Endangered Species Act. Through early site investigations and the NEPA process, any mitigation that needs to take place on site and documented through narrative or drawings is still required. And then we have a number of ANSI and ASTM standards as touch points that we've listed in this section, including the American Standard for Nursery Stock, irrigation standards, soil standards, arboriculture, which is just a fancy term for tree care, and so forth. And then real quickly, what's out of the standards now? The big one is site certification, which Walter mentioned earlier. We previously in P100 had a requirement that all capital construction projects with a significant amount of site work were to earn a site silver rating. That is no longer required. We had a requirement that no potable water was to be used for irrigation. Likewise, that is no longer a requirement, and we are not specific about the water source that can be used for irrigation. We do not have standards for plant species selection, for pollinator support, and for soil management on our projects. We no longer have a minimum number of trees that have to be planted in a parking lot. And with regard to site materials, we don't give preference to regional materials or for recycled content in site materials. And so with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to architecture and Tim Hansman.
Great, thank you very much. Did you want to take any questions first, or?
I think that you hit the question about sites in here, so I think we were good on that one. I didn't see any other specific to Brandon. Thanks, Brandon. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So in architecture in general, we'll be following the ICC codes, ABAS, et cetera, as we did before. So a large section of architecture and interiors will not change. What is going to be added, has not been added yet or not formally issued, is the Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture memorandum. We were given direction to come up with something, and so the final has not been issued yet, but if it follows the previous one from 2020, that will apply to projects such as courthouses, headquarters, buildings in Washington, D.C., other buildings over 50 million, but not a lot of the infrastructure projects or even our land ports of entry, even if they exceed that amount. One thing that was in the P100 and really doesn't have a home quite yet is the Cornerstone Registry of Designers and Builders. We've been told that there's still a desire to have that as a part of our projects, as part of our major projects. But we will probably be issuing that or formalizing that about the same time as the Civic Architecture Memorandum. In terms of vertical transportation, IBC and NEII-1 still apply. Most of the other items relating to elevators, escalators, lifts are in the IBC, and that also references the ASME requirements. And the GSA vertical transportation SME is still the authority having jurisdiction for any of our vertical transportation projects. Next slide, please. In terms of restrooms, the family single occupancy restrooms that we had as a requirement in all of our buildings, there is still a requirement in IBC, but it really just relates to assembly occupancy. So in terms of courthouses, some of our other buildings, there will still be a requirement that kicks in, but not everywhere as we had it before. And the baby changing facilities are still required by statute. Similar for lactation rooms, that was covered by statute. Even if you don't find it in the code, they are still required. The bird safe building design that we had in P100, you may still want to check with your local ordinances. Places like New York City have them on the books, but again, as was said before, be considered, but not necessarily required. And then probably the biggest change in the architecture section is the interior construction performance standards and the finishes standards and the acoustic standards. So even though you won't see the same type of requirements, of course, best practices still apply, and our client design guides for the courts, CBP, HHS will have requirements that will still apply regarding these materials and finishes. With that, I will hand it over to Jason for enclosure.
Hi, everyone. Jason Danielson. I'm the National Architect for Building Enclosures. So just in general, I'm kind of following up with what Tim was talking about. Following ICC codes, CFRs, acts, everything that was identified in section 1 in the general section. Just a few things here we really kind of hit on as far as making sure that we had enclosure commissioning as well as roof commissioning, and that's just to validate that the government got what it paid for. So a couple of these just talking about ASTM E2813 and 2941 and using enhanced commissioning as the default and fundamental commissioning for minor scopes, meaning like a membrane re-roofing or something like that. The ASTM 7877 and 8231 describes electronic leak detection. And then there was a reference in the CBS for the National Roofing Contractors, NRCA. And both of those, the roofing and the waterproofing manuals, are two resources. And at the moment, we don't have access to those. That was lost when we switched to MADCAD, but that's, we'll see where that goes. And then just a general note for this, just to see your local or national building enclosure SME for additional guidance. Next slide. Just a few, I'm not going to go through every one of these, but this just gives a little bit. 2813 and 2947 start to kind of reference a lot of these ASTMs and really getting into air infiltration, water infiltration, and then some others as far as like joint sealants and talking about mock-ups and that kind of thing. So a lot of that is kind of, that's kind of 2813 is your avenue to be able to understand kind of what those requirements are. And that's really project specific and something that the project team would have to work through what's appropriate and what's not. It really comes back down to risk mitigation. And go to the next slide. And building enclosure removal from projects. We kind of talked about a lot of this already, the lead ratings or equivalent and PV panels, bird safe glass. We did as far as if PV panels, if there's a business case for the PV panels, and we probably will hit on this on other sections, that there is, you'd have to have that kind of justification. And then calcs and narratives and some of those that you can see here. And jump to the next slide, please. And some of the security, and I'm sure structural, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the ISC security blast and progressive collapse is still required. And something that's really, especially for building enclosures, and I'm sure it's for all systems, but building enclosures is going to really heavily rely on LCCAs and having quality LCCAs and being able to compare different systems and alternatives and viable alternatives, and being able to kind of have that as a readable and kind of digestible analysis. Jump to the next. This is an example, and so this was added in the FAQ, the CBS FAQ, and this talks about within this is building enclosure service design life requirements. That service life was tied to IBC 1604.5 risk categories, and within there, essential critical action and mission critical facilities are considered that risk category 4. And an office building is under that risk category 3. You'll see some of these where it's in the red square, the large red square, that building enclosures. This is pretty close to what was baseline through tier 2, and just the way that was set up. And that was really kind of intentional during P100 was really kind of set up as kind of associated with risk. So there was some transfer there. And then just using a 40-year service life for LCCAs, and that was in the general. Can you jump to the next slide? And these are just under review, nothing yet, but just, and where IBC right now is at 6.24 PSF, which for water infiltration, which is equivalent to a 50-mile-an-hour wind. And what still need to, what isn't resolved yet is increased performance criteria for locations with higher wind speeds and those associated risks, as well as water penetration, water leakage, and field testing reduction criteria, under slab moisture mitigation, and then air infiltration above 0.40 CFM per square foot, thermal bridging criteria, roof membrane quality requirements, roof service life longer, just a general kind of what we had in before. And it may be best practice at this point is just that roofing service life being longer than the equipment that's placed above it. And then finally, just triggers for including fall protection and scope when doing re-roofs. I think that was it. All these are risks that are still kind of under review. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to structure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Sisson. I'm a structural engineering SME in the central office, sort of backfilling the Oral's position. And I also have expertise in blast, ballistic, forced entry, and hostile vehicle mitigation. And then also Shalise is on the call. She's my counterpart. Shalise, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Shalise. I'm structural engineer under OAE, and my specialty is seismic.
And we'll be pretty short in the structural section, much like the old P100, which the structures chapter was one of the shorter chapters. Things, I guess, haven't really changed all that much compared to P100. We're still following all the same design codes and standards. So everything for calculating your loads and your seismic requirements, your core vibration, that's all still there. I really wanted to harp on the physical security countermeasures, which are still a requirement. The physical security measures are still requirements, and we're still following the Interagency Security Committee Standards, the ISC, and then GSA's interpretation of that document, as well as the progressive collapse resistance of the GSA design guide. So this sort of overall blast and progressive collapse are still a design requirement going forward. I just want to make that clear. There are other physical security measures that are associated with that, like hostile vehicle mitigation, like bollards around your site. Also forced entry, and in some cases, and ballistic resistance. Next slide. And then we'll probably go over this more in detail later, but there are structural requirements that are within agency-specific design guides and standards. Those are listed in the CBS. Ones that aren't listed in there, they won't necessarily be enforcing. I now turn it over to Shalise to talk about some of the things that we have in the FAQ documents.
Hi. So there are a few structural requirements that have carried forward from the P100, and this is a very high-level overview. Oh, can we go back a slide, Ben?
Sure.
Sorry. So this is a very high-level overview. So if you want to take a deeper dive, you can find further info in the CBS FAQ document. The first one we're keeping is the 100 pounds per square foot minimum live load for floors. This allows for flexibility in space use. Some of our older buildings are not designed for 100 pounds per square foot, so those will need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis for what makes sense for that building and project. Pre-stressed concrete floor systems and pre- and post-tension concrete floor systems are prohibited still. There are a few exceptions of those, and you can find those exceptions in the FAQ document. These type of systems do not allow for adaptability in use change, and they also present challenges for blast and progressive collapse design. The third is floor vibration serviceability limits. You can find more information from the references under the CBS for vibrations. And then there's third-party peer review for new and innovative methods and materials. IBC Chapter 1 addresses this, but is also as required and approved by the AHJ. If your project is using innovative methods and materials, be sure to engage your SMEs early. And they're not always obvious, so new materials are, but it can also be things like nonlinear analysis for seismic design. So just watch out for things like that. Next slide. We have two more items that we want to mention. It's delegated design and inspections. Both are covered under the IBC, but are often overlooked since they occur during the construction phase. Key point here is that delegated design submittals need to be reviewed by the structural engineer of record and by GSA. Back to Tim.
And
Sorry.
in terms of that, there's not much that is out. There was, I think, just one standard or guideline that was in the P100, the Structural Engineering Association of California's PV panel wind load, or like wind load design guideline. That's no longer referenced in CBS. However, in cases like that where following it would be industry best practice and would be in the best interest of your project, then it will be something that you can include within your statement of work or your program requirements going forward. But yeah, that's all. I saw there were a few questions in the chat.
I don't think there were any specific to the structural team.
All right. All right. Thank you. Bobby.
Thanks for that, guys. Hey, everyone. I'm Bobby Wager. I'm a mechanical engineer in the Office of Architecture and Engineering. Section 5 of the CBS, which is the mechanical section, highlights industry codes, standards, and guidelines that are relevant to the HVAC and plumbing design for our federal portfolio building types, such as International Mechanical Code, ASHRAE standards, ANSI standards, ASPE, and SMACMA standards. Many of these were previously cited in the P100, so they may look familiar. They are the national standards, so they are still applicable to our buildings. Any standards not directly listed in the CBS are cited in another applicable code, such as the International Mechanical Code. So to avoid redundancy, we weren't just making this, a repetitive list of a number of different things that we know are inherently required. That's what's in the CBS. What's out of the CBS is prescriptive requirements such as minimum chiller or boiler equipment quantities, redundant pump sets and specific material types, say for piping of select hydronic systems. Those are no longer mandated. So we defer to our industry standards and codes for what is permissible in terms of equipment and material types. As Lance had mentioned earlier, there are certain supplemental program of requirements that are still required to be met, like such tenant agencies and IRA supplemental requirements that we need to be paying attention to, making sure we're satisfying the criteria of those standards. And that's about it for me. With no questions, handing it over to electrical.
Thanks, Bobby. My name is Ben Pisarczyk. I'm an electrical engineer here in central office. And I'm unique. I actually have a slide that has our CBS posted on it here so you can get an overview. I'm going to be speaking to a few of these items, but not all of them. So that is what the document looks like for section 6. So moving into what's included. So for lighting, we still have ASHRAE 90.1 that includes the lighting power density, which is very important, along with the lighting control. With respect to power, we have the automatic receptacle control, everyone's favorite. We still have to do that. Also, sub-metering in accordance with ASHRAE 90.1. For lighting, we have the IES standards listed. So most of what you would have found in P100 are still listed, and those requirements were pulled from the IES standards. Those are available in MagCAD, and they still provide guidance to us for interior and exterior lighting designs and installations. So for arc flash, nothing has changed there. We're still going to update the model if it exists when we do work to a building. That is a NFPA 70E requirement. So it is a code requirement. And then for communications, mostly nothing has changed there. We still have the telecommunications distribution manual there referenced for pathways or those sorts of things when installing telecommunications. Yeah, not too far. Okay, not included. So for lighting, we had DLC requirements and Luna, which was new to the 2024 P100. So those are above and beyond code and standards. So those are not required any longer. They were in the prescriptive requirements for P100. For power, there's more than just these few examples here, but a couple of big ones that we've discussed over the years. So UL 1558 switchgear is no longer mandatory for 1200 amps and greater of a service entrance to a building. Switchboards can be used, but I would encourage you to provide quality installations and think about what we're doing there. As far as EVSE goes, so no new installations, chargers, or infrastructure are authorized unless they are deemed mission critical by the tenant. I've seen some of that chatter come in on the in the Q&A. Existing installations must be turned off unless they are mission critical, and there's some guidance coming out on how to turn that off via lockout, tagout procedures, and those sorts of things. You can navigate to the PBS, I think it's 5605.1b, which gives very detailed information with respect to EVSE installations for more information. So a few things that are included that are listed in the FAQ document, the dark sky initiative and light trespass, those are still requirements. Those can still be found in the IES documents, as I mentioned before, specifically RP8 and RP43. Renewables are acceptable, assuming they're life cycle cost effective. So that's the key there. If they're life cycle cost effective, yes, otherwise no. And then moving over to power for EPSS runtime or generator runtime, it would be code minimums. So you can look at NFPA 110 for that. And many times our tenants have their own specific requirements, so we would refer to that. And if in the absence of a specific requirement, then we would look to 110 for requirement. And then spare capacity, it's always a good idea to have some spare capacity in your generator and your normal power system so that when modifications come along, you don't have to replace parts of the system. So instead of 50% spare, which was in P100, we're down to 25% spares, and that is one of the FAQs. Questions specific to my section that you saw come in?
It looks like Jeff is responding to this.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Dave Frable, our fire protection presenter.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Frable. and I'm the manager of the National Fire Protection Program. I work in the Office of Facilities Management, Risk Management Division. So, what are the fire protection requirements in the CBS? As previously stated, the project team must follow all the GSA adopted national codes and standards. For example, the IBC, IFC, NFPA 101, and numerous other National Fire Protection Association codes and standards. They must also follow agency-developed design guides when applicable. And third, they must also use the GSA fire protection specifications that were developed by our office several years ago. These specs are currently being evaluated right now to remove any references to P100. They can be found on the GSA Insight page. One of the key factors that must be taken into consideration when designing fire protection and life safety systems in our projects is that GSA is self-insured. A single loss from a fire could severely impact GSA's ability to conduct operations effectively. Therefore, the project team should also base their design decisions not just on the code requirements, but also on recognized performance-based design practices and industry and GSA best practices to provide solutions that provide an equivalent level of safety, as well as optimizing expenditures during the life of the building. Next slide, please. In addition, each project manager must ensure that a qualified fire protection engineer is a full participant of the project team, from concept stage through occupancy. To make this work, the project's team fire protection engineer still needs to engage with the GSA fire protection engineer through each stage of the project. This will ensure cost-effective project fire protection solutions are achieved. Next slide, please. So what are the major topics not included in the CBS? Special requirements for occupant evacuation elevators, information technology equipment rooms and areas, atriums, residential dwelling units, record storage facilities, stationary energy storage systems, parking structures, and modular rooms, to name a few. Next slide, please. Here's a list of a few major topics that are still required. As stated earlier, a qualified fire protection engineer is still required to be on the project team. The Fire Protection Program Office will still issue a certificate of occupancy to the project managers. The requirements or the exceptions for the installation of portable fire extinguishers will still be followed in accordance with the requirements that were in P100. A redundant fire alarm control unit is still required to be installed in the U.S. Marshal and Command Control Center. And last but not least, here are a few other cost-saving topics that are still being evaluated. The installation of automatic sprinkler protection throughout facilities, the installation of emergency voice communications systems in all facilities, not installing smoke dampers and air distribution systems in certain locations, and not requiring enclosed elevator lobbies and hoistway opening protection in certain locations. That concludes my presentation, and I will now turn it over to Civil. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So for civil engineering design and planning process, it is essential to ensure full compliance with all relevant industry codes, standards, and guidelines. This includes both national requirements and local jurisdictional design criteria, which often tends to be the default criteria for civil design elements. On the inside, first, floodplain management review and design and decision-making process continues to be required. However, only utilize Executive Order 11988 guidance from the 1970s, and will look into project placements in the 100-year floodplain for non-critical action, or 500-year floodplain for critical action designation. Note that updates to the floodplain management desk guide are forthcoming, along with a new PBS order to go with that. We also follow ASCE 2424, which outline flood-resistant design and construction standards. This version includes a robust flood-resistant design update compared to 2414, along with the design flood elevation computation guidance, which now replaces what was under Chapter 4, Table 461. Feel free to reach out to me directly for guidance on how to determine the DFE for ASCE 2424, because I understand that could get a little complicated, but I'm always free to discuss that. For subsurface utilities, we're looking to comply with ASCE 3802 for ensuring proper investigation documentation. The standard closely follows the concepts already in place in the subsurface utility engineering profession, and where many state DOTs are already in compliance with their inclusion of subsurface utility engineering specifications. For ESSA Section 438, I want to reemphasize that stormwater management is not just best practice, it's the law and continues to be a requirement to meet. And as Brandon noted, under Section 2 landscape, the ESSA and stormwater requirement will now fall under civil moving forward. And to re-echo what was noted earlier as well, roof disturbance no longer applies towards a 5,000 square feet computation, once that was a GSA enhancement to the law. Retention under SF 438 in the form of infiltration and or reuse continues to be a requirement to the maximum extent technically feasible. We will also apply guidance from American Association of State Highway and Transportation Official Green Book for roadway and street design that promotes safe and efficient transportation planning. This will be a minimum design standard for roadway related design, with the goal continues to be the utilization of local codes and standards, such as state DOT standards or client agency standards, whichever is stricter. On the outside, some of the requirements being phased out here is the floodplain review per Executive Order 14030 and Executive Order 13690, which included the federal flood risk management standard. That's being revoked, no longer being utilized moving forward. Performance requirements such as the prohibition of coal tar sealants no longer apply, since there is no national prohibition on the use of those elements. However, some states and localities might prohibit the use of that. Also being phased out are our key P100 site development elements for grading, drainage, utility planning, and site circulation, pavement, and geotech hazard mitigation. However, many of these elements would be covered by the applicable client agency standards or the building codes, such as IBC section 1803, which requires geotechnical investigation for certain conditions, and obviously the local authority standards, such as water or sewer authority. And as Lance noted earlier, civil-related reporting requirements will be included in forthcoming CBS submittal matrix, so keep an eye on that. And I am Hani Ramawi. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm a civil engineer with the Office of Architecture Engineering.